The midnight call. Dr. Marcus Henderson had always known the weight of responsibility that came with being a trauma surgeon. But tonight, as his phone buzzed on the nightstand, he felt an unease that went beyond the usual urgency of his profession. The screen glowed with the hospital's name, pulling him out of the few precious hours of sleep he'd managed to snatch. "Dr. Henderson here," he answered, his voice hoarse but alert. "Dr. Henderson, we need you." The voice on the other end said urgently. It was Beth, the ER charge nurse. "There's been a bad accident on Road 62. A young girl, high-risk trauma. She's in critical condition, and you're the only one who can handle this. ETA for arrival is under 15 minutes. Marcus swung his legs off the bed, adrenaline replacing fatigue. He could already picture the chaotic ER, the blood, and the desperate race against time. Grabbing his keys and sliding into his sneakers, he said, "I'll be there in 10. As he stepped into his sleek black sedan, a car he had saved years to afford, his mind raced. Route 62 was notorious, an accident hotspot Marcus had spoken about at length in town meetings. Poor lighting, sharp curves, and barely visible signage made it a nightmare for drivers. This wasn't just another case. It was another failure of a system he couldn't fix. As he navigated the quiet streets of Mayfield, he received a follow-up call from Beth. "Marcus, the patient is Police Chief Armstrong's daughter." The weight of those words hit him like a ton of bricks. Chief Armstrong was a figurehead in Mayfield, a man respected by many, but also a polarizing figure for others. Marcus had crossed paths with him at public events, their interactions always civil but never warm. Armstrong was known for his tough-on-crime stance, but there were whispers about his resistance to conversations on systemic bias, a topic Marcus was deeply familiar with. "Understood," Marcus replied curtly. His focus shifted solely to the girl fighting for her life. There was no room for personal feelings here. He sped down Main Street, his headlights cutting through the darkness. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he glanced at the dashboard clock. Time was slipping away, and with every second, the girl's chances diminished. Suddenly, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. His heart sank. He couldn't afford this delay. Reluctantly, Marcus eased off the gas and pulled over, frustration simmering under his calm exterior. Rolling down the window, he braced himself for what he hoped would be a quick exchange. A flashlight beam pierced through the night, landing on his face. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp. "I'm Dr. Marcus Henderson," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "I'm a trauma surgeon on my way to the hospital. A young girl's life is at stake, and I need tow." "License and registration," the officer interrupted, ignoring the urgency in Marcus's voice. Marcus sighed, his hands moving deliberately to retrieve his documents. "Officer, the patient is Police Chief Armstrong's daughter. Call the hospital if you need to confirm, but I'm losing valuable time here." The officer's flashlight flicked to the hospital badge, clipped to Marcus's scrubs, but his demeanor didn't soften. Another officer approached, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "And why should we believe you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd been here before. This wasn't about his speed or the badge on his chest. It was about the color of his skin and the car he drove. Assumptions that had shadowed him his entire life. "I'm begging you," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "If this were your daughter, would you want me sitting here answering questions? Every second counts." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them walked back to their patrol car to verify his identity. Marcus glanced at the dashboard clock. 7 minutes had passed. 7 minutes he couldn't afford to lose. Finally, the first officer returned, handing back his documents. "You're free to go," he said flatly, as if he were doing Marcus a favor. Marcus didn't waste another second. He sped off, the hospital now just minutes away, but the delay weighed heavily on him. Would those 7 minutes make the difference between life and death? As he pulled into the hospital parking lot, Marcus's heart pounded with a mix of anger and urgency. He had a life to save, but the events of the night had etched themselves into his mind. He knew this wasn't over, not for the girl, not for him, and not for a town that still had much to learn. Inside the ER, Beth was waiting, her face etched with worry. "She's in critical condition," she said, leading him to the trauma bay. "Possible internal bleeding, signs of vascular rupture. We've stabilized her for now, but it's touch and go." Marcus nodded, slipping on a surgical gown. His focus narrowed to a single point, saving the girl's life. But as he prepared to step into the operating room, he couldn't shake the thought that haunted him. Would those 7 lost minutes cost her everything? 7 minutes too late. The emergency room was a whirlwind of activity when Dr. Marcus Henderson entered, his heart still racing from the delay. Nurses moved quickly, voices overlapping with medical jargon as they worked to stabilize the patient. Marcus's gaze fell on the young girl lying motionless on the stretcher, her pale face framed by dark, blood-matted hair. Machines beeped frantically, their relentless rhythm underscoring the fragility of her condition. "Status?" Marcus asked, his voice firm but strained. "Blood pressure is dangerously low, -58/36, Beth reported as she handed him a clipboard. "We've given fluids, but she's not stabilizing. Possible internal hemorrhaging." The paramedics suspected a ruptured femoral artery based on the blood loss at the scene. Marcus glanced at the vitals on the monitor and frowned. The numbers were a grim confirmation of her condition. "Prep the OR immediately," he ordered, shrugging into his surgical gown. "And get a vascular tray ready. We don't have a second to spare." As they wheeled the girl toward the operating room, Marcus noticed a tall figure standing near the observation window. Chief Armstrong. The man's usual stoic demeanor was gone, replaced by fear and helplessness. His hands were pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on his daughter. Marcus didn't have time to dwell on the chief's presence. He turned his focus to the team waiting in the OR, who were already positioning the girl on the table. The room was sterile and cold, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished surgical instruments. For Marcus, it was a battlefield, and every second counted. "Let's move," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're racing the clock." The team worked in synchronized precision as Marcus made the first incision. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the lost time, the questions, the flashlight shining in his face. Those 7 minutes might mean the difference between life and death. Pushing the thought aside, he focused on the task at hand. "Clamp," he instructed, his eyes scanning for the source of the bleeding. As he worked, the room fell silent except for the beeping monitors and Marcus's calm, clear directives. "There it is," Marcus said, his voice sharp with urgency. Blood was pooling near the femoral artery, the rupture worse than he'd feared. "We need suction here. Now." The nurse responded instantly, clearing the area as Marcus worked to repair the damage. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the surgical lights. Every move had to be precise. One mistake could end the girl's life. 2 hours later, Marcus stepped back from the operating table, his hands trembling slightly. The repair was complete, the bleeding controlled. He glanced at the monitors and felt a wave of relief as the numbers stabilized. The girl's life had been saved, for now. "She's stable," he announced, his voice filled with exhaustion but also triumph. "Let's get her to recovery." As the team wheeled the girl out of the OR, Marcus stripped off his gloves and gown, his mind already replaying every moment of the surgery. He had done everything he could, but he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that lingered in the back of his mind. How close had they come to losing her? Had those 7 minutes made her condition worse? Stepping out into the hallway, Marcus was met by Chief Armstrong. The man looked older, his face etched with worry and sleeplessness. When their eyes met, the chief's expression softened with gratitude. "Dr. Henderson," Armstrong said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for saving my daughter." Marcus nodded but didn't respond immediately. He should have walked away, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the lingering anger, the frustration of the night's events. He turned to face the chief fully, his voice calm but firm. "Your daughter is alive," Marcus said, meeting the man's gaze. But it was closer than it needed to be. 7 minutes, Chief. That's how long your officers delayed me tonight." The chief stiffened, his expression shifting to discomfort. I didn't know," he began, his voice faltering. "Exactly," Marcus interrupted, his tone unyielding. "You didn't know. And they didn't care to know. They treated me like a criminal, not a doctor. And those 7 minutes could have cost your daughter her life." Armstrong looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Marcus thought the man might argue, but he remained silent. The weight of Marcus's words hung heavily in the air. "This isn't about me," Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. "It's about a system that allows this to happen. If it hadn't been your daughter, would you have cared? Would they have cared?" The chief's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in his eyes. Regret, maybe even shame. "I'll look into it," Armstrong said quietly, though his words lacked conviction. "It's not enough," Marcus replied, his tone sharp. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but tonight it nearly cost someone their life. If you don't see the problem now, you never will." Before the chief could respond, a nurse appeared, calling his name. "Chief Armstrong, your daughter is awake." The man's face lit up with relief, and he hurried toward the recovery room. But as he passed Marcus, he paused. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer this time. "For everything." Marcus watched him go, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He had done his job, saved a life, but the night's events had left a mark. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Marcus made his way to the doctor's lounge to change out of his scrubs, he couldn't shake the thought that had been gnawing at him since the moment he was pulled over. 7 minutes. 7 minutes of doubt, delay, and systemic bias. And while this time it hadn't cost a life, he knew it was only a matter of time before it did. The fallout begins. The morning light streamed through the hospital windows, but Dr. Marcus Henderson felt no relief. The long hours of the night had blurred into the early morning, yet the tension from the events still gripped him. He sipped on a bitter cup of hospital coffee in the staff lounge, his mind replaying the encounter with the police and the delicate surgery that followed. The girl, Emily Armstrong, was stable now, but her survival didn't erase the frustrations of the night. By the time Marcus made his way back to the ER, the hospital was buzzing with whispers. Nurses and doctors exchanged knowing glances as he passed. Word traveled quickly in a small town like Mayfield, and it didn't take long for the story of the police stop and the life-or-death urgency of the surgery to circulate. Beth, the ER nurse who had been his first point of contact the previous night, caught up with him. "You okay, Marcus?" she asked, her voice low. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. I saved her, but I can't stop thinking about what could have happened if I'd been just a few minutes later." Beth nodded, her expression serious. "People are already talking about what happened. You know how this town can be. Some are calling it a misunderstanding, others, well, they're not." Marcus frowned. He didn't have the energy to deal with the fallout of the night, but he also knew it was unavoidable. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a pattern of assumptions and systemic issues that had gone unchecked for too long. Meanwhile, across town, the police station was anything but calm. Chief Richard Armstrong sat in his office, staring blankly at the stack of papers on his desk. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, colleagues, and community leaders demanding answers. The events of the night before had already spread beyond the hospital and into the public sphere. Everyone knew his daughter had been in a life-threatening accident, but what was gaining traction was the story of the police stop that delayed the surgeon who had saved her life. "Chief, we need to issue a statement," Deputy Henderson, no relation to Marcus, said, stepping into the office with a clipboard. The press is all over this." Armstrong looked up, his face pale. "What am I supposed to say? That my officers delayed a doctor and almost cost my daughter her life. That I've ignored the very issues I've been called out on for years." The deputy hesitated. "We could frame it as a misunderstanding," he suggested carefully. "A procedural mistake." Armstrong slammed his fist on the desk, his frustration boiling over. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They stopped him because he didn't fit their idea of who should be driving a car like that at that hour. And instead of letting him go when he explained, they wasted time questioning him. That's not procedure. That's bias. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Armstrong knew the truth, even if he didn't want to admit it. For years, he had dismissed complaints about systemic bias within his department, chalking them up to overreactions or isolated incidents. But now, his own family had nearly paid the price. "Get me Officer Bradley and Officer Mills," Armstrong said finally, his voice grim. "I want their reports on my desk by the end of the day. And start drafting a statement. No spin, just the truth." At the hospital, Marcus faced his own share of scrutiny. The administrative office had summoned him for an impromptu meeting. When he entered the room, he found the hospital administrator, 2 board members, and the public relations officer seated around a polished wooden table. Their expressions ranged from neutral to anxious. "Dr. Henderson," the administrator began, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We wanted to discuss the events of last night and the attention they've drawn." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "I assume this is about the police stop." The PR officer nodded, her neatly arranged papers betraying her nervous energy. "There's been quite a bit of media interest in what happened. Local outlets are running stories about your experience, and we've received inquiries from larger publications as well." Marcus frowned. "And what exactly are you concerned about?" The administrator hesitated. "We're proud of the work you do, Marcus. You're an invaluable member of this hospital. But we want to ensure that any statements you make reflect positively on the hospital and the community." Marcus felt his frustration flare. "Are you asking me to stay quiet?" "Not at all," the PR officer interjected quickly. "We just want to be prepared. If you choose to speak out, we'd appreciate it if you consulted with us first." Marcus stared at them, his mind racing. He understood their position. Hospitals thrived on community trust. But he wasn't about to let the night's events be swept under the rug. "I'll think about it," he said finally, standing to leave. "But I won't cigar-coat what happened. Not when it almost cost a life." That evening, the story hit the evening news. Local anchor Maria Delgado opened with a somber tone. A small-town tragedy narrowly avoided. And a controversy that's sparking heated debate. Last night, Dr. Marcus Henderson, a renowned trauma surgeon, was pulled over by police while rushing to the hospital to save the life of Police Chief Richard Armstrong's daughter. The delay caused by the stop has raised questions about systemic bias and the critical importance of every second in an emergency. Footage of the hospital and the police station played on the screen, along with an image of Marcus, taken from a hospital event months prior. The report detailed the events of the night, including the police stop, the surgery, and the community's divided response. The phone in Marcus's pocket buzzed constantly as texts and emails poured in. Colleagues, friends, and even strangers reached out, some offering support, others warning him to tread carefully. Marcus ignored most of them, focusing instead on writing a statement he could share when the time was right. At the Armstrong household, tension simmered beneath the surface. Emily was awake but weak, her body still recovering from the trauma. Richard Armstrong sat by her bedside, holding her hand, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake Marcus's words or the guilt that came with them. For years, he had prided himself on being a leader, but now he wondered how many lives his silence had harmed. "Dad," Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but steady. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He forced a smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart, about everything that's happened." Her brow furrowed. Mom told me what the doctor said about the police stopping him. Is it true? Richard hesitated, then nodded. It's true. That's messed up, Emily said, her voice growing stronger with indignation. He saved my life. How could they treat him like that? Richard had no answer. All he could do was squeeze her hand and promise himself that things would change. But deep down, he knew that promises weren't enough. As night fell, the town of Mayfield was abuzz with conversation. The police station, the hospital, and even local diners became battlegrounds for heated debates. For Marcus, the night's events had revealed the depth of the town's issues, but he also saw an opportunity, however small, to push for real change. For Richard Armstrong, the night was a wake-up call. His daughter's survival had forced him to confront a truth he could no longer ignore. Now, the question was whether he had the courage to face it head-on. Voices rising. The following morning, the sun rose over Mayfield, but the tension from the previous night lingered like a storm cloud. Dr. Marcus Henderson stood on his porch, staring out at the quiet street as he sipped his coffee. Despite the tranquility of the morning, his mind was anything but calm. The events of the night before had spiraled into something larger, and he could feel the weight of the town's gaze on him. His phone buzzed on the patio table, breaking the silence. It was an unknown number. Marcus hesitated before answering. This is Dr. Henderson. Dr. Henderson, this is Maria Delgado from Channel 7 News. I'd like to discuss the events of last night. Your story has resonated with a lot of people, and we'd love to have you share your perspective. Marcus exhaled, the idea of reliving the night both exhausting and necessary. I'll think about it, he replied curtly, ending the call. It wasn't the first reporter to contact him, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. As Marcus set the phone down, another message popped up, this one from a community leader he respected deeply, Angela Rivera. Angela. Marcus, I'm organizing a town meeting. People want to talk about what happened. We need your voice there. He stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. I'll be there. Across town, Police Chief Richard Armstrong faced a very different kind of morning. The station was abuzz with activity as reporters camped outside, their cameras trained on the entrance. Inside, tension rippled through the ranks. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the chief's office, where Armstrong sat at his desk, reviewing the reports from Officer Bradley and Officer Mills. Both reports painted the incident as routine, glossing over the delays and casting doubt on Marcus's urgency. Armstrong's jaw tightened as he read. The excuses were thin, the tone defensive. He tossed the papers aside and rubbed his temples, the weight of his position pressing down on him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Deputy Henderson stepped in, his expression wary. Chief, the mayor's on line 1. Wants to talk about damage control. Armstrong nodded grimly. Tell him I'll call back. First, I need to handle this. Deputy Henderson lingered. You sure you want to go public with this? It could get messy. It's already messy, Armstrong replied, standing up. And it's about time we started cleaning it up. By noon, the town meeting was underway at Mayfield's community center. The room was packed, the air buzzing with tension. Residents from all walks of life had gathered, some curious, some outraged, others simply seeking answers. Angela Rivera stood at the front, her commanding presence silencing the murmurs as she called the meeting to order. We're here today, Angela began, to address a series of events that have shaken our community. This isn't just about one night or one person. It's about patterns, systems, and the changes we need to make. She gestured toward Marcus, who sat near the front. Dr. Henderson, would you like to speak? Marcus rose, his heart pounding as all eyes turned toward him. He wasn't used to speaking in front of crowds, but he knew this moment was bigger than his discomfort. He stepped to the podium, his voice steady despite the nerves. Last night, I was called to the hospital to save a life. He began, his gaze sweeping the room. A young girl's life hung in the balance, and every second mattered. But on my way there, I was stopped by police. I explained who I was, where I was going, and why time was critical. Yet I was delayed for 7 minutes, 7 minutes that could have cost that girl her life. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. "This isn't just about me," Marcus continued. "It's about a culture that assumes guilt before innocence, that places bias over urgency. I've experienced it before, and I'm not the only one. But last night, it nearly had fatal consequences." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Marcus stepped back, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Angela thanked him before inviting others to share their thoughts. Among the attendees, Chief Armstrong sat quietly, absorbing every word. He hadn't planned to attend, but something, maybe guilt, maybe responsibility, had driven him to come. As he listened to Marcus and the other speakers, he felt the walls of denial he built over the years begin to crumble. One after another, residents shared their stories. A black teacher recounted being followed home by police after a late night at school. A young Hispanic man described being stopped 3 times in 1 month for fitting a description. The stories piled up, each one a damning indictment of the system Armstrong had sworn to uphold. When Angela called for final remarks, Armstrong surprised everyone by standing. The room fell silent as he approached the podium, his uniform as crisp as ever, but his face etched with weariness. "I want to start by thanking Dr. Henderson," Armstrong said, his voice steady but subdued, "for saving my daughter's life, yes, but also for holding me accountable." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "What happened last night was unacceptable. My officers acted out of bias, and that bias nearly cost my daughter her life. I spent years ignoring complaints, dismissing concerns, and assuming the best of my department. But last night, I saw the consequences of that ignorance." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Armstrong continued. "Change won't be easy, and it won't be fast. But I promise you this, it's starting today. We'll implement mandatory bias training, conduct an external review of our department, and hold ourselves accountable to this community." He stepped back from the podium, the tension in the room giving way to cautious applause. For the first time in years, Mayfield's police chief looked not like a leader defending the status quo, but a man ready to confront it. Later that evening, Marcus sat on his porch, reflecting on the day. The town meeting had been a step forward, but Marcus knew it was just the beginning. Change wouldn't come overnight, and the scars of the past wouldn't heal easily. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the stars emerged in the night sky, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Angela. "Angela, you did good today, Marcus. Proud of you." He smiled faintly, typing back, "It's a start." Across town, Chief Armstrong sat by his daughter's bedside, her soft breathing a reminder of how close he had come to losing her. He vowed silently that her survival wouldn't be in vain. Change was coming to Mayfield, and this time, it wasn't just a promise, it was a commitment. A tipping point. After the town meeting concluded, a group of residents lingered outside the community center, their voices carrying in the crisp evening air. Conversations sparked and flared, some hopeful, others heated. The town of Mayfield was a tight-knit community, but the divide between those who wanted change and those who resisted it was unmistakable. Dr. Marcus Henderson stepped out of the building, feeling both exhausted and invigorated. He had spoken his truth, and it had landed with an impact he hadn't entirely anticipated. Angela Rivera caught up with him, her expression one of determination. "That was powerful, Marcus," she said, falling into step beside him. "People are finally listening." He nodded but kept his gaze on the horizon. "Listening is one thing. Acting is another." Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, forcing him to stop and meet her eyes. "You made them see tonight. That's the first step. You can't discount that." Marcus exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Maybe. But I can't stop thinking about the ones who'll resist. the ones who'll see this as an attack on them, rather than a push for accountability. Angela gave a rueful smile. Change always has its casualties. The question is whether we let their resistance stop us or keep pushing forward. At the Armstrong household, the mood was far more subdued. Chief Richard Armstrong sat in his living room, the lights dimmed, his thoughts heavy. Emily had been moved to a private hospital suite earlier that day, her condition continuing to improve. But the relief of her survival was tempered by the weight of his guilt. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus at the podium, his words striking chords Armstrong had spent years ignoring. The television in the corner played on low volume, a local news segment covering the town meeting. Clips of Marcus's speech interspersed with interviews from attendees filled the screen. Armstrong's gaze lingered on Marcus's face, his calm but firm demeanor driving home a point that had taken root in his mind. His wife, Linda, entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of him and sat beside him on the couch. "How was the meeting?" she asked gently. "Eye-opening," Armstrong admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Linda studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed. "You've been quiet since the accident. What's on your mind?" Armstrong hesitated, then spoke. "I let this happen, Linda. I let it fester under my watch. Last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a bigger problem. And I ignored it because it was easier to look away." Linda reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You can't change the past, Richard, but you can decide what to do now." He nodded, the resolve in her words bolstering his own. "I'm going to fix this," he said. "Not just for Emily, but for everyone in this town." Back at the hospital, Marcus had returned to his rounds, trying to catch up on the cases he put on hold during the chaos of the past day. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to the town meeting and the interactions he'd had afterward. Several people had approached him, sharing their gratitude and their own stories of discrimination and bias. Each account weighed on him, a reminder of how deeply entrenched the problem was. As he entered the recovery ward to check on Emily Armstrong, he was surprised to find Chief Armstrong already there, sitting quietly by her bedside. The chief looked up as Marcus approached, his expression unreadable. "Doctor," Armstrong said, rising to his feet, "I didn't expect to see you tonight." Marcus nodded. "Just doing my rounds. How's Emily?" "She's doing better," Armstrong replied, glancing at his daughter, who was asleep. "Thanks to you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Finally, Armstrong spoke again, his voice low. "I came to the meeting tonight. I heard what you said." Marcus raised an eyebrow. And you were right," Armstrong admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I've spent years avoiding these conversations, telling myself it wasn't my problem. But last night made it my problem." Marcus crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "It's been your problem for a long time, Chief. Last night just made it personal." Armstrong flinched at the words but nodded. "I deserve that. And I know words aren't enough. That's why I'm here, to tell you what I'm doing about it." Marcus tilted his head, curious but skeptical. "I've started an internal review of the department," Armstrong explained. "I've also reached out to an outside agency to conduct an independent audit. We're implementing mandatory bias training, effective immediately, and I'm meeting with community leaders next week to discuss additional steps." It was more than Marcus had expected, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down. "That's a start," he said carefully. "But training and audits won't fix the culture overnight. Accountability has to be real, not just a memo in a file." "I know," Armstrong said, his voice firm, "and I'm prepared to follow through. This isn't about saving face. It's about making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Marcus studied the chief's face, searching for any hint of insincerity. Instead, he saw a man grappling with the weight of his own failures and determined to make amends. Slowly, Marcus extended a hand. "We'll see," he said, "but if you're serious about this, I'll hold you to it." Armstrong shook his hand, the gesture carrying more weight than either of them had anticipated. The next day, the ripple effects of the town meeting continued to spread. Local businesses displayed signs of solidarity, and social media buzzed with hashtags calling for change in Mayfield. The police department announced its new initiatives publicly, sparking both praise and skepticism from the community. For Marcus, the shift felt tentative, like the first cracks in a dam that had held back years of frustration and injustice. Angela called him that evening, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "We're seeing momentum, Marcus. People are talking, organizing. This could be the start of something big." Marcus leaned against his kitchen counter, the exhaustion of the past days catching up with him. "It could be," he agreed. "But it's going to take more than talk to make it last." Angela chuckled. "You're a realist, and I respect that. But don't underestimate what you've already done. You made people see what they've been ignoring. That's no small thing." Marcus sighed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "One step at a time, I guess." "One step at a time," Angela echoed. "But don't stop stepping." Bridging the divide. A week had passed since the night that shook Mayfield, and the town still buzzed with the aftershocks. Conversations about systemic bias had taken root, no longer whispered but debated openly. Some embraced the dialogue, eager for change, while others resisted, clinging to the familiar. For Dr. Marcus Henderson, the week had been a whirlwind of work, interviews, and reflection. Yet, through it all, a quiet determination kept him grounded. One morning, as Marcus prepared for another long day at the hospital, his phone buzzed with an unexpected call. The name on the screen made him pause. Chief Richard Armstrong. Marcus stared at the phone for a moment before answering. "Dr. Henderson." "Marcus, this is Richard Armstrong," the chief began, his voice steady but hesitant. "I was hoping we could talk. In person." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised. "About what?" "About how we move forward," Armstrong replied. "I'm meeting with community leaders this evening to discuss the changes we're implementing in the department. I'd like you to be there." Marcus hesitated. The idea of sitting down with the man whose officers had delayed him that fateful night was uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny the importance of the conversation. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be there." That evening, the meeting took place in the multipurpose room of the Mayfield Community Center. The room was filled with a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Activists like Angela Rivera, local clergy, small business owners, and even a few officers from Armstrong's department. The tension was palpable as Marcus entered, his presence drawing attention. Some nodded in recognition, while others avoided his gaze. Chief Armstrong stood at the front of the room, flanked by Deputy Henderson and a representative from the outside agency conducting the department's audit. His uniform was crisp, but the lines on his face betrayed the weight he carried. "Thank you all for coming," Armstrong began, his voice steady but firm. "I called this meeting because it's clear that we, as a department, and I, as a leader, have fallen short. The events of last week were a wake-up call, not just for me, but for this entire community." He glanced at Marcus, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. "I want to start by thanking Dr. Henderson for his courage and his honesty. His actions that night saved my daughter's life, and his words have forced me to confront things I should have addressed long ago." The room was silent as Armstrong continued, detailing the steps his department was taking. Mandatory bias training, an external review of policies, and a new community oversight board to hold the police accountable. As he spoke, Marcus found himself studying the faces of the officers in attendance. Some looked engaged, others defensive, but all were paying attention. When Armstrong finished, he opened the floor for questions. Angela was the first to speak. "Chief Armstrong," she said, her voice calm but firm, "these changes sound promising, but how do we know they'll stick? This isn't the first time we've heard promises of reform." Armstrong nodded, accepting the challenge. "You're right to be skeptical. That's why we're involving the community every step of the way." The Oversight Board will have the power to review complaints and recommend action, and the results of the audit will be made public. Transparency is key. Another voice spoke up, this one more confrontational. What about the officers who pulled over Dr. Henderson? What happens to them? The room grew tense as all eyes turned to Armstrong. He met the question head-on. Both officers are under review. If the investigation finds that their actions violated policy or were influenced by bias, they will be held accountable. Marcus felt a flicker of hope at the chief's words, but he knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Change would require action and persistence. After the meeting, Marcus found himself approached by Angela and Armstrong. "Good meeting," Angela said, her tone measured. "But the real work starts now." Armstrong nodded. "Agreed. Dr. Henderson, thank you for coming. I know this hasn't been easy." Marcus studied the chief for a moment before replying. "It's not about easy, Chief. It's about necessary." Armstrong extended a hand. "I hope we can work together moving forward. I've got a lot to learn, and I'll need people like you and Angela to help keep me accountable." Marcus hesitated, then shook the man's hand. "We'll see, Chief. It's a start." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the meeting began to show. The police department rolled out its new training program, and the Oversight Board held its first meeting. Meanwhile, the external audit uncovered troubling patterns in traffic stops and use of force incidents, prompting further reforms. The findings were met with mixed reactions. Some hailed them as a step forward, while others bristled at the scrutiny. For Marcus, life at the hospital returned to its usual hectic pace, but the events of that night and the movement it sparked were never far from his mind. He continued to attend community meetings, lend his voice to discussions, and push for progress. One evening, Marcus received a call from Angela. "I've got news," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "The state is sending a team to study what's happening here in Mayfield. They want to use it as a model for other towns." Marcus was taken aback. "A model? We're barely getting started." "Exactly," Angela said. "But it's proof that what we're doing matters. People are watching, Marcus. This is bigger than Mayfield now." At the Armstrong household, the changes were deeply personal. Emily was recovering well, her strength returning with each passing day. But the accident had left its mark, not just on her body, but on her father. Richard Armstrong had thrown himself into the work of reform, determined to make the department he led worthy of the community it served. One night, as he sat with Emily, she asked a question that caught him off guard. "Dad, do you think Dr. Henderson forgives you for what happened that night?" Armstrong paused, considering his answer. "I don't know, Emily, but forgiveness isn't what I'm after. What I owe him, and this town, is action. If I can do that, maybe one day I'll earn it." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "I think you will." As the weeks turned into months, the changes in Mayfield began to take root. The town was far from perfect, and the road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time in years, there was a sense of possibility, a belief that progress was not only possible but inevitable. For Marcus, the journey had been exhausting, challenging, and at times infuriating. But as he stood on his porch one quiet evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Change was slow, messy, and imperfect, but it was happening, and that was enough to keep him going. Seeds of change. Months had passed since the night that had irrevocably changed Mayfield, but the ripples it set in motion continued to grow. What began as a single event, a delayed surgeon, a near tragedy, had sparked a movement that neither the town nor its residents could ignore. Dr. Marcus Henderson had become an unexpected symbol of resilience and change, though he still saw himself as simply a man doing his job. On a warm summer evening, Marcus sat on the porch of his modest home, sipping a cup of tea and reviewing the notes for his latest hospital initiative, a mentorship program for aspiring medical students from underrepresented backgrounds. It was a project close to his heart, a way to channel his frustrations into something productive. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was Angela Rivera. "Marcus," she said, her tone a mix of excitement and urgency. "We need you at the town hall." "What's going on?" Marcus asked, setting down his mug. "They're voting on the Community Oversight Board's expanded powers. There's pushback from some of the usual suspects, but we got momentum. Your voice could tip the scale." Marcus sighed. The past few months had been filled with meetings, speeches, and more attention than he ever wanted. But he knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. "I'll be there," he said. At the town hall, the atmosphere was electric. The large meeting room was packed with residents, from seasoned activists to skeptical business owners. Police officers, both in uniform and plainclothes, sat scattered throughout the crowd, their expressions ranging from cautious to defiant. At the front of the room, Chief Richard Armstrong stood near the podium, flanked by members of the Oversight Board. Angela spotted Marcus as he entered and waved him over. "Glad you made it," she said. "We've got a lot of support, but there's resistance too. Some people think this board has too much power." "Let me guess," Marcus said dryly. "The people who've never had to answer for their actions." Angela smirked. "Exactly." The meeting began with a presentation from the Oversight Board, outlining their proposed expanded powers. These included the ability to subpoena officers for testimony, recommend disciplinary actions, and publish quarterly reports on department activity. As the details were read aloud, murmurs of approval and dissent rippled through the room. When the floor opened for public comments, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit was the first to speak. He introduced himself as Tom Grayson, owner of a prominent local business. "I support accountability," he began, his tone measured. "But this proposal goes too far. Giving unelected civilians the power to oversee law enforcement undermines the authority of the police. We need to work with our officers, not against them." A smattering of applause followed, mostly from a cluster of older attendees near the back. Angela leaned toward Marcus. "Here we go." Next, a young woman stepped forward. She identified herself as Maya Ortiz, a college student who had grown up in Mayfield. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described the fear she felt every time she was pulled over, despite having done nothing wrong. "This isn't about undermining anyone," Maya said, her voice steadying. "It's about making sure people are treated fairly. Accountability isn't a threat. It's a promise that we're all equal under the law." Her words drew a louder, more enthusiastic round of applause. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he watched her take her seat, her head held high. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as he approached the podium. "I'm Dr. Marcus Henderson," he began, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Most of you know why I'm here. That night months ago wasn't just about me or Chief Armstrong's daughter. It was about a system that failed, a system that almost cost a life." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Accountability isn't about punishing officers. It's about making sure the system works for everyone, not just a select few. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Marcus locked eyes with Grayson, whose expression was unreadable. "To those who say this goes too far, I ask, how far is too far when lives are at stake? When trust in our institutions is broken? This isn't an attack on law enforcement. It's an opportunity to build something better." The applause that followed was deafening. As Marcus returned to his seat, he caught a glimpse of Chief Armstrong nodding subtly, a gesture of solidarity that carried unexpected weight. The vote passed, 8-3 in favor of the expanded Oversight Board. The decision marked a turning point for Mayfield. While not everyone was satisfied, the momentum for change was undeniable. Over the following weeks, the board began its work in earnest, conducting reviews and engaging with the community to rebuild trust. For Chief Armstrong, the journey was one of humility and growth. He met regularly with Angela and other community leaders, often inviting Marcus to join. Though their relationship was initially strained, A mutual respect had begun to form. One evening, after a particularly productive meeting, Armstrong approached Marcus as the room emptied out. "I owe you more than just a thank you," Armstrong said, his voice low. "You were right to call me out that night. I spent years avoiding hard truths, but I'm trying to face them now." Marcus regarded the chief, noting the sincerity in his expression. "It's not about me, Chief. It's about the people who've been living with those truths their entire lives." Armstrong nodded. "I'm starting to see that. I know I have a long way to go, but I want you to know I'm committed." "We'll hold you to that," Marcus replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Months later, the changes in Mayfield began to bear fruit. The Oversight Board's quarterly reports highlighted significant decreases in complaints of bias and misconduct. New policies prioritized de-escalation and community engagement, and the department's training program was lauded as a model for other towns. For Marcus, the journey had been transformative. He continued to advocate for equity and justice, but he also found solace in his work at the hospital and the mentorship program he had launched. Watching young, aspiring doctors find their footing reminded him of the power of opportunity. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave the hospital, he received a visit from Emily Armstrong. Now fully recovered, she had come to thank him personally. "Dr. Henderson," she said, her eyes bright with gratitude, "you didn't just save my life. You changed it. My dad talks about you all the time, about how you opened his eyes. I just wanted you to know that what you're doing matters." Marcus felt a lump in his throat, but managed to smile. "Thank you, Emily. That means more than you know." As she left, Marcus stood in the quiet hallway, reflecting on how far they had all come. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. In the years that followed, Mayfield became a beacon of progress. The reforms sparked by a single night spread to neighboring towns, creating a ripple effect that no one could have predicted. And while there were still challenges to overcome, the seeds of change had taken root. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. But as he stood on his porch one evening, watching the stars twinkle in the vast sky, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was long, but he knew he wouldn't walk it alone. Together, they were building a better future, one step at a time.